Bonjour, ani. Niganasque, Indigenous cause, Dashkan Zibing and Dunjaba, Aji Jack Adoram. My name is Jaimie Kechego. I'm the Indigenous Coordinator of Indigenous Curriculum and Pedagogy. So very glad that you're able to join me today. This is a long session, and by long, I mean we have a lot of participants here today with us. So I don't know that we'll get into that discussion that will allow us to have some, deep, inviting questions or comments. But I ask you to, as if questions pop up, write them down, write your comments down, and hopefully we can, have a discussion at the end. So let's begin. Miigwech. Meaningful integration of Indigenous pedagogies. This was from Pulling Together, a guide for indigenization of post-secondary institutions. It's a professional learning series. I prepared it for this territory. And that reminds me, I should do a land acknowledgement. I am still working on my land acknowledgement. It's a work in progress. But I want to acknowledge the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy, the Anishinaabe, the Potawatomi, and the Wyandot. I also want to acknowledge guests on our land, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous. So glad you're here with me on Turtle Island. Thank you, Miigwech. So, I know this is a big question. How do we do this? How do we do it in a kind and good way? And what do we offer? So the purpose of this session, we're going to explore Indigenous Epistemologies, what that means, Indigenous Pedagogies and what that means, ways to integrate Indigenous epistemologies and pedagogies into curriculum design. Thoughtfully interwoven content and approaches must be informed by an understanding of Indigenous epistemologies, how knowledge can be known, and pedagogies, how knowledge can be taught. While there is much diversity among Indigenous peoples, and therefore among Indigenous ways of knowing, meaning it's not the same across the board, we have a lot of similarities, but some nations do things differently. Indigenous ways of knowing, teaching, or learning. Many Indigenous scholars have argued that there are also some notable commonalities among Indigenous societies. And that's from Kechego, Deloria, and Wildcat, Hampton, and Henderson. Indigenization of curriculum requires much more than adding Indigenous content. In an education system that has since its inception and into the present day, valued Western ways of thinking almost exclusively. Indigenization of the curriculum requires us to bring Indigenous ways of thinking, being, and learning into course design. This section provides a discussion of Indigenous epistemologies and pedagogies and how these can be interwoven in curriculum design and development. This session is intended to help you integrate Indigenous epistemologies and pedagogies in curriculum design and development. This session includes those following topics: epistemologies, pedagogies, and ways to integrate. So we're going to begin with relationality. It is the concept that we are all related to each other, to the natural environment, and to the spiritual world, and these relationships bring about interdependencies. So right here, I want to share a personal story with you. Going to elementary school, from the time I could understand that I was different, meaning I had brown skin and I wasn't Caucasian, I noticed that anything Indigenous was left till the end. So, maybe it was the last month in school and the teachers were kind of like, I'm not saying didn't want to put in the effort to make a lesson plan for that month, but when they did with Indigenous peoples, it was usually one day, one page, maybe about 1 hour out of the whole school year that Indigenous people were mentioned. And to say that it was a specific group, right? So I learned a lot about Iroquois, Haudenosaunee peoples. I didn't really learn about Anishinaabe peoples until I got a little bit older. And I used to wonder about that. But that was my elementary experience, and all the way up until post-secondary, until I could focus. I could pick classes and programs that focused on Indigenous issues and education and learning. So, relationality for curriculum developers. They can apply this concept by creating learning opportunities that emphasize learning in relationships with fellow teachers, students, families, members of the community, and local lands. And I'll give you an example of this. When I got my master's of professional Aboriginal education from Western University, they had struck up a partnership with Chippewa the Thames First Nations Reserve, my reserve that my community is at. And this partnership, part of it was that our classes took place in Chippewa, not at Western, in Chippewa. We did have to go to Western for some of the courses, but ultimately, there were, part of that partnership was, okay, well, Chippewa can host some classes here, some courses here this summer. And so there's that, that building that reciprocal relationship of learning, right? I just wanted to share that with you because I know people need examples. I know myself, I need examples. I'm a visionary learner. I need to see things to learn them. Sacred and secular. According to Hoffman, Aboriginal ontologies and epistemologies are rooted in worldviews that are inclusive of both the sacred and the secular. In Indigenous ontologies, the world exists in one reality composed of an inseparable weave of secular and sacred dimensions. So, ever since COVID started, a lot of First Nations were, I thought, doing really good. Now that the Delta variant has come out and there are new variants coming out, I have noticed that a lot of communities are getting hit hard again. Well, hit hard. And so we've been going to a lot of ceremonies for people who passed on, right? And in going to those ceremonies to see those people complete their journey as they move through the spirit world, this is what I think of when I read this. So how can I share that knowledge of that ceremony with you in a way that you can learn from it or you can teach it? These are questions that I ask myself, and I invite you to ask yourself some questions too as we go along. While there is much diversity among Indigenous peoples, and therefore among Indigenous ways of knowing, teaching, or learning, many Indigenous scholars have also argued that there are also some notable commonalities among Indigenous societies worldwide. In Western educational approaches, spirituality is often seen as a taboo in the classroom. In an Indigenous approach, spiritual dimensions cannot be separated from secular dimensions, and spirituality is a necessary component of learning. This does not mean that students need to embrace a specific religious approach or practice, but that rather educators should not ignore the spiritual development as a component of learning. So in other words, when a student comes in and says, for instance, and I'll probably use Sundance as an example a lot, but if a student comes in and says, I have to go to Sundance this week, usually, hopefully the teacher or professor would be understanding and give them that time so that they can do ceremony, because that's a part of their well-being. That's what helps them function as they sit in your class. The principle of holism is linked to that of relationality. As Indigenous thought focuses on the whole picture because everything within the picture is related and cannot be separated. So I thought I'd share this picture of this, I believe they're called tiger lilies, but on my reserve we call them ditch flowers because they grow rampantly around and in the ditch. Beautiful flowers. And they're, as you can see, the design in the middle of that flower looks like a star to me. And how that design came to be is that whole flower had to work together right from the root system, being a part of the earth and coming up, growing, getting what it needed, water, air, sun. But that's all connected to make that flower look like that. Cindy Blackstock, who was the executive director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society of Canada, identifies 4 interconnected dimensions of knowledge that are common in Indigenous epistemologies: emotional, spiritual, cognitive, and physical, which are informed by ancestral knowledge, which is to be passed to future generations. In Indigenous epistemologies, these 4 elements are inseparable, and human development and well-being involves attending to and valuing all of these realms. You can't separate them. I can't take my Indigenous out of me and put it somewhere in a corner so I can thrive in a Western society or a Western institution, organization. It can't be done. Indigenous philosophies are underlain by a worldview of interrelationships among the spiritual, the natural, and the self, forming the foundation or beginnings of Indigenous ways of knowing and being. And so I've started my journey in this role. And that's the other thing I want to share too. Not every Indigenous person is going to know all this Indigenous knowledge because of residential school and the Indian Act. Indigenous pedagogies. Here we are getting to the meat and potatoes, right? This is what I get a lot of questions about. What are they? What do they look like? What do they feel like? And it's hard to explain because, you know, we're all new in this journey together, right? So when I try to explain these things, I don't necessarily have like hundreds of years of journal articles and research articles that I can give you or share with you. So the research that's coming out now about Indigenous pedagogies, I am so appreciative of. And if you have found any articles, I encourage you to share them with me, share them with your co-workers, share them with faculty and staff. Absolutely. So a basic assumption of Indigenous education scholars is that there are modes of Indigenous pedagogy that stem from pre-contact Indigenous educational approaches and are still ingrained in Indigenous contemporary culture. The exclusion or devaluation of Indigenous pedagogies can create a barrier to academic success for Indigenous students. I would say staff too. There's a limit of genuine understanding of Indigenous culture and history for all students. And this prevents people from learning how to exercise highly valuable and useful modes of thought, which could potentially address many problems in the modern world. Some key commonalities among Indigenous pedagogical approaches are outlined. So let's have a look. The personal and holistic. So this image, I revamped it a bit. I put you at the center. Because if you're looking out at these 4 quadrants, it's you that is getting that education. It's you that is experiencing that. So, for example, Indigenous approaches can be brought to light by providing opportunities for students to reflect on the 4 dimensions of knowledge: emotional, spiritual, cognitive, and physical. And cognitive, you will probably see mental a lot in these images. Excuse me. As a result of the epistemological principle of holism, Indigenous pedagogies focus on the development of a human being as a whole person. So you just can't take what you need from that person. It's the whole person. Academic or cognitive knowledge is valued, but self-awareness, emotional growth, social growth, and spiritual development are also valued. It is a use for curriculum developers to keep this in mind when creating experiences that interweave both Indigenous and Western ways of knowing. Experiential. I use this image of the deer because that's the closest one I could find. When my brother tried to teach me how to gut a deer, it was similar to that, except he had a pulley. And he tried to make me lift that deer with that pulley. I couldn't lift that deer. It was a doe. She must have weighed like, I don't know, 85 pounds or something. She was heavy anyways. But then the most important part of his lesson, and the one I remember the most, because when my son was a baby, I didn't like changing his diapers. So my brother said, you want to cut here, and he showed me, but you don't want to cut here because if you cut here, you're going to hit the poop sack. If you hit the poop sack, it's all going to go flying everywhere, and you don't want to do that. So I remember that because that's a valuable lesson. Who wants flying poop on them, right? But it was an experience that I'll never forget, and I still hold it dear to my heart to this day. So Indigenous pedagogies are experiential because they emphasize learning by doing. In traditional pre-contact societies, young people learned how to participate as adult members of their community by practicing the tasks and skills they would need to perform as adults. In a contemporary setting, an emphasis on experiential learning means a preference for learning through observation, action, reflection, and further action. For curriculum developers or people who are trying to include Indigenous knowledge into their courses or programs, this also means acknowledging that a personal experience is a highly valuable type of knowledge and method of learning, and creating opportunities within courses for students to share and learn from direct experience. Place-based learning. So this goes back to the example too I gave you about Western doing that partnership with Chippewa to have some classes held out on the reserve. Indigenous pedagogies connect learning to a specific place, and thus knowledge is situated in relationship to location, experience, and a group of people. For curriculum developers, this means creating opportunities to learn in a local place and to learn in connection to that local place. So for example, I already shared that with you, sorry. The master's program. Intergenerational. In Indigenous communities, the most respected educators have always been elders. In pre-contact societies, elders had a clear role to play in passing on wisdom and knowledge to youth, and that relationship is still honored in practice today. Some elders are knowledge holders of 60 different Indigenous languages in Canada, and language is a key component of Indigenous culture that should be integrated in teaching practices if we are to move towards indigenization of curriculum. Both Indigenous and non-Indigenous students can learn a lot from elders, and curriculum developers can seek opportunities to engage with elders as experts in Indigenous pedagogies. They would never themselves claim to be experts, though. In this picture, the boy there in the black, that's my dad. And it's believed this was taken 1959 to about 1963, maybe. This was at Mount Elgin uh, Mount Elgin Industrial Day School. Um, I think all of these young boys, men, have passed away, save for two of them now. And that's why it's so important to learn from the elders, because all the information, all the knowledge that they had went with them. Tribal and Indigenous education is really endo-Indigenous education, in that it educates the inner self through enlightenment and illumination from one's own being and the learning of key relationships. Therefore, the foundation for tribal Indigenous education naturally rests upon increasing awareness and development of innate human potential. So it's the gifts within me. And it took me a long time to find out what my gifts were. So I consider myself a helper. I help people, whatever that may be, whatever they need help with. It took me a while to recognize that that's my role. No matter what I do or where I go, I'm going to be helping people. And that didn't come from Western education. That came from my own empathy and my own patience and my own work that I have done on myself to be able to sit here and share this information with you without being, because at one point, these issues or Indigenous pedagogy without my voice shaking, because that's how passionate I am about it, or that's how triggered I might have got by some of the information. I continue to work on myself so that I can be in this good state of mind as I share this information with you, because it is my intent to help you get to where you need to be as you try to indigenize your courses or programs without putting anybody on the defensive. Now, I recognize that there's enough yuckiness to go around for everybody, and sometimes we have to battle through that yuckiness to get to that beautiful point on the other side. And sometimes that work has to be done. There's no avoiding it. The learning spirit. Tennyson states that the learning spirit is a conceptual entity that emerges from the exploration of complex interrelationships that exist just between the learner and his or her learning journey. He also notes that lack of identity, lack of voice, and low self-esteem can damage the learning spirit. So, when you have a First Nation student in your class, unless they specifically come up to you and say that they're willing to share or they're willing to teach or do something like that, don't call upon them for their knowledge or their expertise, I want to say. I was in a class when Stephen Harper did the apology. And, I never liked him when he was elected. I still don't like him. And the apology, it was written. It wasn't from the heart. He was reading words. So the professor turned around, looked at me, and asked me in front of the class what I thought. That was a really emotional moment for me. It's because I honestly believe probably half that class, did believe that, the stereotypes about Indigenous people's welfare were a leech on the health system and, all that other stuff. And so when she asked me what I thought, I didn't hesitate. I said, he's an asshole. I don't believe him. And I don't believe the government of Canada either. And I never will. It doesn't matter who we elect. So that stuck with me as I share it with you. I can share it in a calm manner now, but before, You know, let's just say it took me a long time to get to this point, and I'm glad I'm here and I can share with you all. So, integration of Indigenous knowledge in post-secondary curriculum will strengthen the learning spirit of both Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, because holistic learning engages the four domains, right? Remember, I talked to you about that, the emotional, cognitive, the mental, the physical, the spiritual. So if you can, find a way to interweave all these aspects of learning from the Indigenous pedagogical point of view, you're off to a good start. Now, this is an activity, and I'm going to send the PowerPoint out to you all. This is 10 minutes, but there is one PowerPoint that I want you all to listen to. And we're going to listen to that one together. But basically, this is giving you a roadmap of how to begin. So if you go back and you watch this, I strongly encourage you to take notes and jot down. There's two ladies who discuss how to integrate those worldviews into your pedagogy, into your curriculum. And just for time's sake, I don't necessarily want to focus on this video, but there is an important one coming up. So just bear with me, and I apologize, of course. Like I said, I'll send the PowerPoint out to everybody. You can do that activity. It is individual, so you can take time and watch that video and really let it soak in. And I thank you for understanding and your patience. These activities, you'll notice they're all individual. So they really want you to sit back and think about how you learned what you learned. And then look at the principles of how Indigenous people learn. Once again, there are there's a few resources here, very important resources. When you get time, it's an individual activity, explore them. They're great ways if you're trying to make a roadmap, if you're trying to grasp Indigenous knowledge and curriculum. They're great ways to get you started. Cindy Blackstock. She, the breath of life versus the embodiment of life. A great article. I sum it up in just like 5 words or less. She looks at the title. She looks at the breath and the embodiment, and she describes the difference, so that you're, as the reader, as the learner, I like the way that she wrote the article because I could understand it. I could follow it. It wasn't a big leap, so to speak, going from Western to Indigenous or Indigenous to Western. And you notice a lot of these activities in this session are individual. Once again, I feel it's because they really want you to look at how you learned what you learned and how Indigenous knowledge exists. Activity 4, you're going to look into understanding how Indigenous and Western knowledge systems differ. And Cindy Blackstock's article sets you up for this. So let's look at some of these questions, though, because you really got to look at yourself, right? What values or beliefs do you think underlie Western approaches? And I answer these questions myself too. I'm not just zooming through this. I did these activities as well. So values or beliefs that I think underlie Western approaches, I would have to say money. What values or beliefs do you observe in Indigenous educational approaches? It's a complete it's 360. It's not just linear. It's not linear. There's no beginning and no end. That's how I see Indigenous educational approaches. You are a lifelong learner. What are the areas where conflicting views arise? So some of the arguments I've heard are, Western organizations like universities don't have space for Indigenous knowledge because they're based in Western knowledge. Funding is always a big one. Money makes the world go round. And then what are the areas where commonalities can occur? And that was a tough question for me. I gotta be honest. And I'm still pondering that one. What are the benefits for all students of integrating Indigenous approaches into curriculum? Make a note of any questions that you may still have about this topic. Reflect on your thinking and how you would answer these questions. Integrating Indigenous epistemologies and pedagogies into curriculum design and development. Okay, so here we go. Right? Here it is. Here's what we're getting at. There's the honeypot. Pooh the bear is about to jump in and enjoy, right? But you have to look at these things before you get carried away. Goals. Does the course goal include holistic development of the learner? So remember the medicine wheel with the learner at the center. If applicable, does the course benefit Indigenous people or communities? I would say that, Western benefited from having us go to Chippewa, the Thames First Nations Reserve, and having some of our classes held there because we were able to start building relationships. My colleagues had to reach out when we were planning our ceremony at the end, getting ready to graduate. And so organizing a ceremony, my colleagues had to reach out to people that they never had to talk to before, right? So that's just one example. Learning outcomes. Do the learning outcomes emphasize cognitive, emotional, physical, and spiritual development? Is there room for personalization, group and individual learning goals, and self-development? So, excuse me again. As I'm a part of this universal design grant journey, I have found it difficult to write the learning outcomes for these types of learning outcomes, because I think about the things I've learned, say, learning from elders, right? So elders will tell a story, and in that story, there might be some repetition. Repetition is one of the ways that I've learned, because it helps me remember stuff, right? Or I'll be like, oh, that elder didn't talk about that, but this elder talked about it. Not in any way disparaging either elder. All of that knowledge is good no matter what time it comes at. But so it helps me remember, oh, that elder said that, or this elder taught that. And I think it's when I see non-native people who experience that way of learning, they're always like, why are they repeating themselves? And at times I'm like, well, you're not the only learner here. There are some other people here that may have never heard this before. Assessment is also another one, a hard one. As I try to put it on paper, I think that's the most challenging part of having Indigenous knowledge and knowing how I know what I know, and then putting it on paper has been challenging. Relationships. Are there opportunities for learning in community, intergenerational learning, and learning in relationship to the land? There are always opportunities to do these things. There are always opportunities. We have to reach out and build relationships, reciprocal relationships with the First Nations in our area to do these things. Does the course include learning beyond the classroom walls? That one's my favorite. If you can take me out of the classroom for a couple of days a week, as a child, I would have loved that. But learning outside the classroom, I think that knowledge is not seen as valuable. So, when a kid's walking and they pick up a stone, right? And they're just like, I don't know about you, but I've had many stones, many rocks from my son throughout the years. But he's teaching me something every time he picks that rock up. And he talks about it. And, he'll tell a story about it, but there's a teaching in there. So understanding Indigenous epistemologies and pedagogies is the first step. The next step is taking the action to integrate them into curriculum development. Often educators turn to learning activities as a first step in indigenization. However, including or adapting learning activities without changing other aspects of the curriculum is not a holistic approach to indigenization, and in some cases can result in trivializing and misappropriating those activities. So for those of you who attended that session about how to integrate activities, so I used a totem pole, cardboard totem poles as an example. And the teacher, she didn't do any work behind it. She just Googled something, got it off the internet, and brought it to her class. Didn't outreach to the local First Nations for their help. And so that is, I think, a great example of how you can trivialize and misappropriate. The next example, the teacher reached out to the community, the Indigenous community. They actually designed and made a totem pole. They raised it. They had ceremony with that raising and everything that went into raising or making a totem pole. And the community was deeply involved. Another activity for you. Examples of courses that interweave Indigenous knowledge. So this first example is a non-Indigenous educator. She shares her original and revised syllabus and reflects upon her process in learning as she worked to indigenize her course. In reading her reflection on her course, Teacher as Leader, pay attention to the process she used to indigenize her course, the collaboration with Indigenous colleagues, and her own learning journey throughout that process. How does her shift in focus from content to values align with Indigenous pedagogical approaches? Review the following case studies of post-secondary courses that have been developed to interweave Indigenous knowledge. Notice how these courses have considered Indigenous approaches in all of the aspects listed above: goals, learning outcomes, learning activities, assessment, relationships, and format. So here's the video that I thought would be most beneficial to share with you all today. It's about 10 minutes. I'll put the words up as well, because sometimes the volume comes through and sometimes it doesn't.
Scala Kesla, as we begin our third topic for the course, Learning from Indigenous Worldviews. The focus of this topic is to help familiarize you with theories of learning that emerge from Indigenous peoples' accumulated wisdom, their values and experiences, their ways of knowing and being in the world. You will be introduced to a range of Indigenous education frameworks that can be applied to policies, practices, and the curriculum of schools. I'm going to first discuss some of the underlying themes within the education frameworks that will be shared in the conversations and readings within this topic. I'd also like to use this opportunity to introduce you to Sarah Davidson, a PhD candidate at the University of British Columbia, who is supporting this course as a teaching assistant. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you, Jan. Jan invited me to join her here today to both introduce myself to all of you and also to talk a bit about how I have taken up some of the concepts from the Indigenous education frameworks in the classroom. I have worked with adolescents and adults in the classroom for close to 10 years, and during that time, I have drawn on many of the concepts from some of the Indigenous education frameworks in my practice. We thought that it might be useful to share some more practical examples as we work through some of this material.
And this is great, Sarah, as this will be helpful for us. Educational processes that are really committed to redressing an educational past, changing the way we do things in educational settings today, and making places of learning responsive to upcoming generations of Indigenous learners to ensure their success must also be committed to creating, supporting, and sustaining learning environments that reflect Indigenous ways of knowing. Culturally responsive approaches to education have been telling us for a long time now that when learning ignores the cultural and linguistic backgrounds of students, there's resistance and there's lack of engagement. And I'm suggesting, as have many others, like Gloria Ladstone-Billings, who pioneered this very concept of culturally responsive education, that when we accommodate for the values that students bring to learning, their patterns of communication and behavior, sources of knowledge that they give priority to, and their histories of living and learning, it is then that we can really engage them in learning. Indigenous knowledge systems play a role in creating learning environments that are culturally responsive to Indigenous students. But as I've said previously, approaches to learning that are inclusive of Indigenous ways of knowing have benefits for all learners. Leading Indigenous scholars such as Linda Smith, Marie Batiste, Brian Brayboy, Graham Smith, Joanne Archibald have all described for us the contributions of Indigenous knowledges to places of learning in their scholarly work. And I'm not looking here to describe a single definition of Indigenous knowledges. Rather, I want to sensitize you to what you should be appreciating and listening for in the conversations that follow in this topic, as well as reflecting on the materials that you will be reading. The Indigenous education framework shared with us in this topic, while quite different in the context from which these emerge and the ways they're given expression, have some commonalities. These frameworks are described as values or principles and represented as visual models. As I describe some of the commonalities within these frameworks, I want to be careful not to overgeneralize these worldviews, as I really think it's important to acknowledge that Indigenous peoples have very complex ways of thinking about the world. But I do want to characterize and explore some of the underlying values and experiences, as well as perspectives that will help give meaning to these frameworks and their application to educational settings. What we see in these frameworks are approaches to learning that are holistic. They emphasize social, emotional, mental, and spiritual aspects of learning. These frameworks advance ways of knowing that are experiential, land-based, tied to narrative, traditions, and promote intergenerational learning. And I know, Sarah, you want to share an example of one of the frameworks with us in your teaching.
I'm most familiar with the First Peoples Principles for Learning. They were initially identified in relation to English 12 First Peoples, which is a high school course offered here in British Columbia. Though they don't represent the pedagogy of an individual First Nation, they do reflect some of the ideas more broadly. Currently, they are also being used to guide the development of the new First Peoples curriculum and classroom resources. Basically, these principles focus on how learning is holistic and supports the well-being of the learner, the role of multiple generations in learning, Indigenous knowledge and the associated protocols, and the importance of relationship and connection both to people and land.
You know, Sarah, these principles for learning bring to mind recent work by Linda and Glenn Goulet in their newly published book, Teaching Each Other, Cree Concepts and Indigenous Pedagogies. Similar to the First Nations principles that you've introduced us to, they've drawn on principles from Cree thought and addressed their application to the classroom. What is helpful to understanding their application are the stories by educators that accompany the explanations of the concepts, much like the way you're sharing your experiences here with us, Sarah. These stories of educators and the concepts come together to form a model that identifies important features to be considered when creating classrooms that will successfully support Indigenous learners. At the core of this CRE model of effective teaching are relationships. Relationships are central within all the frameworks revealed in this topic. Relationships to self and one another, creating connections to the land, the ancestors, and the material world around us. These frameworks are expressed through those relationships. Further, they describe for us sources of knowledge, what counts as knowledge, and processes of conveying knowledge.
Relationships have really been at the heart of everything I do in the classroom. I genuinely believe that it isn't possible to engage in any kind of learning if a relationship has not been formed between the educator and the students in the class. In my own classroom, I used journals with the students. This was a place for them to write about experiences in their lives and for them to share those experiences with me. In return, I would share those stories my stories with them about my life. The students enjoyed reading the short pieces of information I shared with them about my family or about a time when I was embarrassed or proud. I have also used personal narratives with students to provide a different perspective for them to consider and also to develop relationships with them. I have found that in sharing stories from my life with the students, I am able to establish connections. These do not have to be stories that are personal. Students are often interested in anything from what time I get up in the morning or what I ate for breakfast to a time when my brother and I got into trouble as kids. I find that these stories help them to relate to me and to see me as a human being as opposed to just an educator. And I have found that sharing the stories in the journals and through personal narratives go a long way toward building these important relationships that are really the foundation for learning to occur.
I really appreciate the example that you've given us, as it really demonstrates the power of stories and the power of stories to create relationships. One way to help the participants of this course think about the characteristics within these frameworks is to reflect back on the history of schooling for young Indigenous people, where they were taken away from their family, they were taken from the land, they were taken away from their languages, they were taken away from the very rhythm of their lives. In this look back, we realize what was lost, what was taken from these children. And it's in the striking contrast, the striking violation of the residential schools and certainly other experiences of forcible child removal that we see how very different Indigenous ways of knowing are from those of schools. This comparison is not at all to suggest that current educational practices are similar to residential schools, but to point out that these ways of knowing may stand in sharp contrast to what we think schools should be about. Another strategy to help you make sense of these characteristics that resonate within these frameworks is to consider mapping these Indigenous education frameworks onto your own personal and professional assumptions about what knowledge and skills mainstream schooling values. You may see similarities, and you will certainly also see differences.
Actually, this idea reminds me of Elder Verna Kirkness's talk, where she discusses the work that she did with Ray Barnhart on the 4 Rs. Respect, relevance, reciprocity, and responsibility. More specifically, I think it connects with her discussion about reciprocity, where she spoke about the importance of recognizing the contributions that everyone can make to education, that educators should be looking to engage with students in a more give and take relationship, and the importance of exploring ideas together with no one being the expert. She also talked about sharing with the community and working with elders. She felt that we need to work together to know each other better so that we can understand why other people think the way that they do. We all have different values and we all bring them with us, but we need to understand and respect those values and each other.
Thank you. Finally, you will need to ask, how are you challenged by these frameworks and how we can implement them in policy and practices and the curriculum of schools?
Part 2 of that interview is included with the PowerPoint. So again, these are all individual activities that you're encouraged to explore and look into. What I really liked about that was her example of the classification system. And, you know, that is one teaching that I have had throughout my whole life. when I have been with Indigenous knowledge holders is that, yeah, Mother Earth doesn't depend on us for anything. She'll go on long after we're gone, and it's us that depends on her. So I, for one, would have been interested to take her class and see how she does that, because it sounds fascinating, and it sounds kind of fun, and something that I probably would have remembered. So activity 2 is a call to personal research, indigenizing your curriculum. Different ways of knowing means that we approach learning and knowledge in different ways and use different methods to learn. The differences are clearly outlined in two charts that are provided from the Alaska Native Science Commission. And they go more in depth into the poignantly titled article by the same group, What is Traditional Knowledge? When an elder dies, a library burns. So remember what I said before. They take that knowledge with them. So building those reciprocal relationships with elders and the communities that they come from, not only benefits the person reaching out, but also the people that you're going to be sharing that knowledge with. Integrating restorative principles and Indigenous ways of knowing into any class enables you to be a transformative educator who claims a part in social change mobilization. Also, adhering to the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action. Joe Desjarlais, a Métis scholar and community activist, has encouraged, when you are starting this work, that's a good question. Like, where do I start? How do I do this? Start with what you have. Start with what you know. So, for instance, you have me. You have the Aboriginal Education Center. You have Can-Am Indian Friendship Center, the Ontario Federation of Indian Friendship Centers. You have Southwestern Ontario Health Access Centers for Aboriginal people. You have other First Nations education organizations who share their resources. And I'm going to use the orangeshirt.org for an example, because, September 30th is coming up, and that's been recognized by the government as the National Truth and Reconciliation Day. On their website, they have resources for teachers, and it goes by grades. So, I mean, even when, even when if you've been teaching for over 20 years, and, if you look at some of these resources and you think they're kind of like childish, I honestly don't think they are, because if the government wasn't teaching you about Indian Act, and if the government wasn't teaching you about residential school, these resources are the best resources they have available out there for you to use and to weave into your curriculum. I also wanted to say something about integration and weaving. So integration, to me, from a Western point of view, is taking that square piece and trying to bang it into that round hole, right? Weaving is recognizing that, my squareness won't fit within that round hole. So we're going to find a way that makes sure that I can learn, even though it doesn't fit. But I still want to learn about what does that hole involve? What's in there? Like, So that's my understanding and my personal opinion about integration and weaving. So again, start where you are with what you have, and I'll help you. I just want to say that I'll help you as much as I can. I'll help you. Activity 4 is a critical review of your curriculum. This activity is going to provide an opportunity for you to critically review and adopt a lesson, activity, or assessment that you have used in your teaching and to revise it and incorporate Indigenous approaches. Now, if you've already done this, I know there's there's an ownership to some of these things, but in Indigenous knowledge and pedagogies, we don't own that knowledge. We don't. And I will never claim to own the knowledge that comes within the medicine wheel. And you won't meet anybody Indigenous who will claim that. But I ask you to share with your colleagues and talk about it, because you never know what that colleague is doing over here. And so, you could benefit each other by talking about it. I find that when you do talk about it, that's where, the connections come from, right? It's like, oh, this is what I did. This is who I talked to. Maybe they can help you. Or, if they can't help you because they're pretty busy, and I think about I think about Catherine Pasquatch and Russell and Michelle Noddy. And even myself, sometimes I get really busy and I can't help the way I want to, but I might know somebody who can help you. So don't hesitate to reach out, and again, don't hesitate to talk. If a conversation happens in which there's a way that you can be helped, then my belief is that it was meant to be, and it's progressing the way it should. And time is not a big it's not a big factor for Indigenous. For myself, I'm speaking for myself. I'm not going to speak for anybody else. But for me, when somebody asks me for help, it might take me 1 or 2 days or up to 2 weeks to find some sort of way to help. So it doesn't always happen overnight. It doesn't always happen in 5 to 10 business days either. And if you are planning anything, I strongly suggest that you plan ahead, because, for instance, September 30th, a lot of Indigenous folks are already booked or already doing things. Another one is July 21st. National Indigenous Peoples Day, or whatever it's called now. But that's another one. So if you want somebody to come in and talk on that day, you have to prepare beforehand and make sure that you can get somebody to come in and talk. This is activity 4, continued. And this is asking you that after you finish your adaptation, that you reflect on the following questions. So, and I think these are really valuable questions. These are questions that I appreciate both as a past student and as somebody who's sharing this knowledge with you now. Does every student have the genuine opportunity to develop a deeper understanding of and respect for Indigenous ways of knowing? So it's not saving the Indigenous folks for the last day of the last class in school. Who's that benefiting? I'm not going to read these all to you. There's just a couple. Do all students have the chance to teach someone else, and through doing so, contribute to the community as a whole? In my opinion, most students do have something to contribute, but again, you have to build that relationship with them. You can't just call them out as the moment arrives, right? Stephen Harper, what did we discuss before that in regards to Stephen Harper and the apology? Nothing. What did we discuss after that? Nothing. It was just in that moment, in that time. Here's activity 5, and this is what I've been talking about a lot, is sharing your examples of work. So how can you share the work you have done in your critical review and lesson adaptation activities with others? How can you learn about efforts that others in your institution or other institutions have taken towards indigenization of curriculum? Consider ways to share in person or through text these examples in a way that supports learning from each other. So I've joined probably two groups that specifically talk about Indigenous knowledges and talk about these positions, such as mine, and how they're doing in these institutions. And so it's kind of, one is kind of a support group, the other one's like a community of practice. So there are ways that you can do it. You can start your own community of practice about indigenizing the curriculum, sure. Or you can hop on other sites like, the massive online open course from the University of Alberta. They have references, and that's the other thing, sorry, I want to mention is, go through the references of these resources. And that's another way that you will find some more information about Indigenous knowledge and curriculum and pedagogies. So the key learnings from this session. There is great diversity in Indigenous approaches and epistemologies, but they generally share a holistic approach, which recognizes interconnected dimensions of learning: emotional, spiritual, cognitive, and physical. The delivery of Indigenous pedagogies is the most powerful when it includes collaboration from elders. And I'm going to go beyond elders and say the Indigenous community as well. Indigenous and non-Indigenous students benefit from holistic learning. Growing up, again, I grew up here in Windsor from the time I was about 2 or 3. My dad and my mom worked out an agreement, and so we came up here to Windsor, and my education began at Marlborough Public School. I didn't know I was Indigenous until the teacher pulled me inside and said, "What band or what tribe are you from?" And when I went home to ask my dad, I remember he got upset, and he wanted to know, why do they want to know? I don't know. And I was so young when that happened, but I remember he was so upset. But I didn't know my identity. And all my dad said was that we're Chippewa. And, he never taught me anything more about that. And talking to my grandma, probably when I was about 12, 13, having conversations with her about Indigenous knowledge, she had told me that to survive in a white man's world, I would need Western education, and that the Indigenous education and identity, that wasn't going to benefit me. It wasn't going to help me succeed or move ahead. So, being told that you're different, but you don't know why you're different, or you don't know who you come from or where you come from, I can tell you that does have a negative effect on an Indigenous student's identity. So I struggled, and I want to talk about that learning spirit because my learning spirit struggled. I didn't see myself reflected back in any of the schools I went to. The students that were, I want to say, supported and held up to the highest were mostly Caucasian students. I never understood that until I got older. But that led me to believe that I didn't have anything valuable to contribute to my education or the education of others. And so I was a quiet learner. I didn't speak in classes. I didn't offer any of my thoughts or questions because I thought I was stupid. And it wasn't until I got to post-secondary where I really found my voice. And I felt empowered by it because there were other Indigenous people here like me who didn't have that identity either. And so I started learning about myself, learning about Anishinaabe, learning about Chippewa the Thames, about who I am, where I come from. I still had relationships with my family, but mostly just my mom. So I didn't even know who my aunties and uncles were at one point. You know, I would be with my mom for a visit on the weekend, and she'd be like, "Oh, this is your uncle so and so." Stranger to me. I don't know him. Um, and it wasn't until I got older when I could be around, you know, my uncles and my aunties and be with my community that way that I really started getting to know them. And so I struggled. I became across the board, all those stats you see. I was in each and every category. So I was a young single mother. Um, I had my son when I was 18. I had great family support. I realized the value of education and identity when he was born. And so I pursued everything up until where I am now, sitting here with you fine people and sharing this knowledge. Um, but for me, it's come full circle, you know. From my grandma not being able to talk about her culture, her family, her language, all the way to me here sitting with you talking about all this stuff. And so I guess I'm just really humbled by it, of course. And you know, at times it does get heavy. At times it does get heavy, but my learning spirit, I'm going to tell you, it came back at post-secondary. And I had wonderful mentors, Relationality. You know, I remember sitting in his office when Turtle Island House was still standing, and I was looking at his degree on the wall, and I looked at him and said, "Russell, one day I'm going to take your job." It was a goal, and we laughed about it, and he thought that was awesome. But, you know, it's just because I had somebody, I could see somebody in that role, and then all of a sudden it just seemed like it wasn't impossible anymore. And if Russell can do it, then I can do it. And it turns out, actually, I'm not so stupid after all. I wish I would have had that knowledge sooner, but, you know, the creator works, universe works in mysterious ways, and so here I am today, talking about these things that we've all should have been talking about from day one, before government came down and said, you know, this knowledge is good, but this knowledge is not. So I just think the government's just so messed up that way. So this section provided a brief discussion of Indigenous Epistemologies and Pedagogies. As Indigenous epistemologies are firmly rooted in relationality and the interconnectedness of the sacred and secular, we must engage in social, emotional, and spiritual dimensions of knowledge when moving toward indigenization of the curriculum. Remember that elders play a key role in sharing and passing on of ancestral knowledge, and therefore are integral to efforts to indigenize curriculum. This section's brief summary of Indigenous epistemologies and pedagogies is a good place to start. But in reality, these concepts cannot be deeply understood through reading. And to be fully known, they must be experienced through collaborative work with Indigenous people and communities. There's the references. Also, the links are throughout the PowerPoint, so you'll be able to click on them and they'll take you right to the page. And that is the end. Okay? And with that, I'll say Bamapi, which means see you later. And until the next time, take care.